Hi everyone. Thank you for coming. I'm Sara Olshansky. These are my paintings. The show is called From Beneath and Far Below. And I asked Megan to do a Q&A with me, my good friend. So
You want me to?
yeah.
Hey everyone. I feel like I know a good amount of you already, but I'm Megan Bickle. I'm a local painter and writer and digital humanist and educator and curator. I run House Guest Gallery over on the South End. Yeah, I think that's it. Let's dive into this.
Let's do it.
Yeah. That's all y'all need to know about me. So I wanted to start by asking, or maybe having you introduce us to the methods for how you construct these paintings. I think that'll be like a good way to enlighten some of the other questions that I have for you.
Yeah, definitely. So, I mean, all of the paintings start with a study of a set of images that I collect. Those images might be photographs I've taken of Kentucky, of the ecology in Kentucky, throughout my experience as like a groundskeeper and a gardener. So, I sort of collect all these instances that I'm seeing throughout those days. I'm also looking at Hudson River School paintings, um, looking at public media images of weather events, and it sort of like starts with this amalgamation of all those sources. Typically I have some kind of underpainting that's in like reds and oranges, and then the fully rendered landscape, it starts with that. It's sort of built on top of the base, and from that image, the paintings undergo a series of heavy layering and masking. So they are sort of like an accumulation of images which repeat the information in the initial landscape. And the result is an image that looks as if it is shifting or in motion. And that's kind of a very quick explanation of how these are made. So we can get into more detail.
Yeah.
It would be helpful. So I mean, the masking, it's like, so I'm using, I'll talk about the materials. I'm using a silica-based acrylic. Silica is, I think, the most abundant compound in soil. So it's kind of interesting in landscape painting, but it is a mattifying agent. It sort of creates this matte finish, but it also quickens the cure times. So the thing about the silica is that I could make several layers in a single studio session. So it sort of enables this layering.
And silica paint is what we also know as acrylic paint, right? So like some of you might recognize that term a little bit.
Yeah. Yeah, silica, I always like to kind of explain it's also used, it's in like concrete, these things that are like combined and cured. It also has some industrial applications which have been interesting. Some of the materials I've been using do sort of have these double functions in an industrial setting, which I have been excited about using. But yeah, it's about like enabling those quick succession of layers. Because these end up with up to 15 different iterations of the same information.
Yeah, it sounds like the metaphor within the material that you're using in it being acrylic paint is pretty lofty for you. It feels like connected to the subject matter. It feels connected to like industrialization and agriculture and its connections to one another, maybe.
Okay, certainly.
Yeah.
And some of them are finished in oil, so it sort of points back to this long history of the painting. but also I always just love the materiality of oil.
Mhm.
You know, it's just an interesting and fun medium. You know, some of this is about the fun of making paintings with the materials that I've used.
Yeah. 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 I mean, there's definitely a lot of joy in the mark making, but sort of in that. And I mean, a lot of my work kind of it funnels at like a same place or feeling, I think, right?
Mhm.
Like there's a lot of joy in the mark making, but then there's this sort of like hesitation or pause that happens in a lot of like the cultivation of the image. And that happens a lot here. I think like in this body of work, like in the act of deciphering what we're looking at, there's a moment of contemplation that often leads us to kind of an ambiguous place.
Yeah.
Right? Yeah.
Yes, ambiguity is something I'm trying to make these um landscapes which start, you know, sort of like easy to read, trying to break them up and make them sort of like a visual problem, or difficult to read, or perhaps containing too much to understand at once, you know, kind of setting up puzzles maybe
Mm-hmm.
to piece together, which is fun. And yeah. um, Sometimes I think it might force people to stay with them longer,
Mm-hmm.
kind of inspire like prolonged looking. At least that's the hope. So,
The hope of the goal.
hmm
So, sort of in that, I'll kind of move to like my next question. So, though your work has consistently recalled the fallibility of memory, which I think this kind of this breaking down and this question and this ambiguity kind of leads into the considerations around memory and how it kind of it ebbs and flows, it comes to us, it leaves us, it enters, it departs, right? There's always kind of like a waving of our experience of memory. Um, your drawings, for those of us that are familiar with Sarah's drawings, um, always refer to the body as a subject, often referring to loved ones and friends as source material. But you've recently obviously shifted towards the land and the garden as a subject. Do you want to discuss that shift a bit?
Sure. I have to admit that that shift wasn't something I thought very deeply about
Sure.
when it happened. But you know, the similarities carry over. I think a lot of like what you said, this sort of idea about um, the elapse of time or problematizing a linear progression of time is something that started in those drawings. But um, I found myself, you know, sort of in a place where I wanted to push these into um, abstraction by fragmenting them and repeating these images. And I don't, there's like this reluctance to fragment the images of people, you know, which is strange, that I feel
There's a reluctance for you. Okay.
yes, like in making them, I didn't want to sort of push them past this place of
Okay.
recognizing who they were. As like
Sure.
it became sort of the portrait making process instead of you know, letting all these ideas about time play out. And yeah, it's like I kind of had this like precious way of approaching those drawings.
Right.
But I think that the figure or the body is doing the same thing as the land in these. You know, they have the same role, and sort of are a means to understanding these ideas, these overarching concepts
Of time.
Yes,
Right.
yes.
And memory.
Mm-hmm.
Do you think the kind of like indecipherability of the land or this kind of like I wouldn't say it's idealized, right? I don't think that it is. I don't think these are our ideal images of land. They're not bucolic in any way, but they are sort of dreamlike.
Mm-hmm.
Do you think the ambiguity of the land kind of gives you the distance to think about like these weaknesses of memory and experience in a way that like depicting people you know doesn't give you maybe
Yeah, I think that's
because people aren't like searching for the subject.
Right. Yeah, I think so. I mean, I could see that. It's interesting that I feel okay with, fragmenting these natural spaces. It's sort of like, it does sort of, create this violent sort of transition of
Mhm.
the image into something unrecognizable from something that was like built up with care. And,
Yeah.
that's sort of strange, that I feel okay to do that. But it felt like that was a way to sort of mimic or demonstrate climate crisis and the ways that things change so quickly. And that's sort of one departure from the figure drawings is it's sort of considering that new theme.
Mm-hmm.
Although it's like I don't know. I sort of think that these involve the viewers in a way too. These are like the proportions might suggest like the proportions of a person looking at them. So, these sort of motions that I was setting up with the figures as mimicking or mirroring the action of the viewer moving around it, those things might still happen in these landscapes.
Okay.
So the effects might be similar, maybe.
Okay.
If that makes sense.
Okay. Yeah. I'm thinking it becomes complicated when we think about it in the scale of land, right? Because we don't have this like 180 degree view of what we are looking at. So it does feel like a little bit more personal,
Yeah.
in like this interesting way. And they're kind of like just big enough in some instances to sort of like draw you in closer, but they're small enough in that when you are drawn in closer, you are drawn in closer with another in close proximity. So there's a type of like interpersonal intimacy there that is kind of forced. So I think it's kind of interesting.
Yeah.
I mean, originally in my notes, and this was, I guess like editor's notation here, we discussed this a couple of days ago, and my original question was, where have the people gone? Right? So like these images feel in some instances very bucolic and dreamy and surreal in this very positive sense, and then there's other instances where they feel as if there is a falling apart, as if there is a crisis at hand. And so the question of where have the people gone becomes a little bit more ominous, maybe.
Yeah, I've been thinking about that question a lot, and it does seem, all the actions that are being placed, like, or all the ways that I'm fragmenting them are sort of derived from the ways that we have cut across and like segmented and fragmented natural spaces into just pieces of its former self.
Sure.
So those those gestures are sort of it's sourced from how we interact with the land.
A mimicking, maybe.
Yeah. But yeah, it's interesting to think that they, are devoid of people, and that kind of makes me think of Hudson River School.
Sure, right.
Sort of like how large and terrifying they were because they were, um, unexplored. That was sort of their like take
The
on it.
ideation. Right. Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, another direction that one could consider is that the land becomes the replacement for the body, right? Like the land is the body.
Yeah.
It's the original body.
Right.
In a way.
Yeah, which is why I say that it's strange that I feel okay to, fragment these and make, sort of deconstruct them in those ways, because I do think there are a lot of similarities across those two bodies of work, these two bodies of work, and the body and the role that they had.
Right. Yeah. They don't feel violent. I mean, you had mentioned that like you have like a little bit of like a discomfort there, but like in the perception of them, they don't like contain a hostility or a violence towards like the subject that you're depicting. It feels like a morphing. It feels like
Yeah.
bearing witness to a change that is happening beyond the speed with which you could grasp it.
Interesting. Yeah.
So it doesn't necessarily feel like, as opposed to like, the extreme sense of that would be like the atomic bomb, right? Right.
Mhm.
Like this instantaneous change that is
Right.
also violent, but also somewhat imperceivable in some senses.
Mhm.
This doesn't feel that way, which is interesting.
Yeah. They seem to track, different speeds of change.
Yeah.
Some which are immediate and some which take place over long, extended periods of time. But the point is that those all sort of exist simultaneously
Right.
and occur
Right.
at the same time because it would problematize linear progressions of
Right.
time.
Right. It becomes a conversation about a non-linearity, perhaps.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Right.
Um, on the topic of bucolic imagery and violence, do you feel like these are a warning? Do they feel like a warning or no?
I think that's a fair read. I mean, I think it's hard to talk about landscapes today without talking about
Right.
climate change and the crisis that we're witnessing.
Yeah.
And there's sort of like the language around it is kind of like, here it comes, here it is, watch out kind of thing. So I think, yeah, warning is certainly a part of this and the discussions of, how natural spaces are changing and how rapidly they're changing. So yes, I think they certainly contain some warning in them. But I think that is because they are deconstructed sort of systematically over this progression of like how I make them.
Right. Right.
But if they're alinear or nonlinear,
Yes.
then maybe the deconstruction could also be reversed and be seen as a reconstruction.
Right.
So at what point are you looking at these? Because I think they could move both ways, just given the like structure of time that they present.
Yeah.
Which I like. I like that they can be both of those things.
Totally.
Sort of oppositional positions at one time.
Yeah. I mean, coming back to like the comment about like the joy and the luxury and the pleasure, frankly, of painting, right?
Yeah.
Like if we are thinking about this in terms of like nonlinear time, if we're thinking about this in terms of like a representation of something that is expanding or falling apart, if it is nonlinear, then it also has the capacity to bloom and be invigorated and be restored or, to incur growth, right? So in this multiplicity, we have the opportunity for all of those things, which is, I think, a more accurate representation of what we are experiencing in the climate crisis.
I think so too. Yeah. They're both fragile and, resilient in that they can regenerate and repair.
Right.
So yeah, I don't want it to be all like doom. It's like these are joyous as well. It's about like celebrating what we have currently, celebrating paint, those kinds of things.
Yeah.
All at once.
Right.
Yeah.
Let's talk about art history.
Okay.
So I wanted to hear a little bit about the effects of Cubism. We've talked a little bit about Futurism as well, and Impressionism on your practice. All of which are thinking about time, all of which are sort of motivated or pulled from this era of dimensionalism that was inspired by Einstein's theory of relativity, right? So like all of these movements are thinking about the incursion and the experience of time and how it was changing in their particular moments in history. And you've cited almost all of them as things that have motivated your practice. Do you want to talk about them specifically?
Yeah. Cubism I looked at a lot for my early drawings. That's this idea of simultaneous sort of occurrences. That was something that I looked at Cubism to inform, those decisions. Um, so I think maybe Impressionism, I mentioned, sort of took Cubism's place for these. I mean, the idea of these being topographies, that sort of are high points and low points of the past versions of the landscape, sort of butting up next to the latest versions, and that collapse makes me think of the surfaces in Impressionism. They sort of like vibrate among these
Right.
like luminosities, so you do sort of get this like I don't know,
Energy feel.
yeah, like
Yeah.
it's sort of undulating and yeah, like there are moments where the objects arise from it, sort of in that like high point, low point
Yeah.
feeling. So yeah, I mean, I think Impressionism is very important to these. And then Futurism, which gets a little more complicated, is is something I look at to inform the masking shapes, which break up the full rendered landscape. They sort of it makes me think of those images they did of planes where it sort of like was breaking through the surface of their paintings, in this sort of shattered way. So, they inform the shapes of the masks, which also sort of imply movement, I think. So they are they I think give the effect that these are moving or accelerating.
Sure.
And thinking about futurism is interesting because they ended up sort of glorifying like the development of cities, technology,
Right.
moving quickly across space, these expressions of control over space and time. Yeah, so what does it mean to apply their gestures to these images that I'm kind of creating from my experience of Kentucky, like my home state, and the idealized landscape of Hudson River School. And it's like, if you think about the ways that the land is broken up now, I kind of mentioned this already, but we're like building like infrastructure to travel across expanses, sort of making it efficient and like it's a rigid sort of like travel across space. So I think it's interesting to use those shapes here. Yeah, those are the ways I'm thinking about those different historical moments, and they all sort of offer like examples of how people are using paint to think about time and motion and space.
Yeah. I think the futurists are particularly interesting because we were talking about this the other day, but the futurists started as anarchists who believed in a violent society as an ultimate form of freedom, right? They believed in like a collapse of the government that came through warfare, and they wanted to divorce themselves from the entire history of art. And as Mussolini came closer into power, they became closer to and closer to and closer to until they were, and they fully became fascists who were in favor of warfare and the development of technology of war. They were also technologists. They were early adopters of futurism. Really fascinating group of people. But I think their practice of interrupting time in the image and this idea of violence is really interesting, right? Because it ultimately becomes about this sort of like exploding of the image plane, which is what we're seeing here. So for me, and I mean, this is me kind of projecting all over the work a little bit, but like this inherent violence and this tie to that particular moment in our history is one that is like very critical of power and how we think about the land and our relationship to it, right? Like it feels really enriched by considering that and deconstructing that a bit. I don't know. What are your thoughts?
I agree. I mean, it's like interesting as a painter today. I mean, you think about what does it mean to be a contemporary painter? What does it mean to make landscapes, today? And I think it's essential to sort of like look at the medium in its past and what it meant, how it's been used,
Right.
because it's a position that is something we should be like interrogating, because it does. And sometimes these paintings do end up like paintings throughout history have become propaganda for things like that, and this relationship of the painter or the painting to those sort of movements, political movements, is worth looking at. And it's, I agree with you that using their gestures to sort of show emotion, it's like shattering across space,
Right.
that's sort of where I was getting at with like these have some inherent violence in them,
Right.
because they do break away from their original state just from all these accumulation of all these gestures. And they do have a meaning, historical, a historical meaning, which is being enacted and sort of appropriated to explain or mimic the climate crisis. At least that's how I'm thinking about it.
Yeah.
Yeah. That's interesting.
This talk gets really dark for a minute, so
bear with
us. It does like come up to some levity at the end. Where is the apocalypse?
So,
because I mean, like we look at these and
where is it?
Yeah, where is it? Is it in there?
When is it?
Yeah, when is it? Why is it?
I mean,
who is it?
Who? I don't know. It makes me think about, I start all these with reds and oranges. Right. Feels like I'm starting them from fire. Or if you're thinking about geology, like from magma. Sure, right. Building up levels of earth and land, and it's kind of a rich like place to start these.
Yeah.
So if these are putting past and future alongside each other simultaneously, does that mean these like fiery bases or apocalypse possibly are like existing throughout this expanse of time?
Right.
It's an interesting thing to think about. Certainly they might hint at apocalypse. There are events that are like thunderstorms and lightning in this painting, or fire. There are things that sort of allude to it, or just generally deconstructing these landscapes might kind of point to apocalypse, I suppose. But I think, the important thing, and I go back to the point about if these are deconstructions in nonlinear time space, then they could be reconstructions.
Yeah.
So apocalypse maybe is woven in in between the moments of like nature and wilderness, but they're equal to it.
Yeah.
So the joy of being there is also equally a part of it.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. I mean, we've also talked in the past about how medieval depictions of hell have kind of come into your imagery, and I like, forgive me, I can't recall the title of it, but this painting that's on the far left of the wall over here, specifically, really, it pulls a lot from the scale and color palette in particular of is it Hieronymus Box, The Garden of Earthly Delights? Right. So like if we look at this image, we start seeing these like what could be characters aren't characters, but are in fact just marks, right? But we start like seeing these sorts of like depictions of space in an interesting way.
Yeah.
That start to pull from some of that imagery. And I think for me, some of that apocalyptic feeling kind of carries from that like historical note of like the end of days, right?
Right.
Because the apocalypse in contemporary discourse is of the same breadth and manner.
Yeah.
Right.
It's interesting to think about. I mean, those medieval, they were often like triptychs with options.
Right.
You know, it's like you have the in between.
Yeah.
And heaven and hell. So it's like, again, these polarities existing at once and a travel between them.
Right.
You know, and so it's kind of like, will you go this way or this way? You know, it's like sort of presenting. I mean, it goes back to the idea of warning.
Sure.
It sort of ties all into that. But yeah, I mean, medieval landscapes are strange. I mean, I agree. It's like this way of depicting time. It's almost like tilted or something. Having this sort of linear, it's almost like a path top bottom, you know, of the scenes happening, which is kind of interesting. But yeah, I mean, it's strange that I look at the hellscapes, but they're
wild.
They are wild. They're there. They're definitely in the paintings.
Yeah.
Certainly.
But I think ultimately, in all of that type of imagery, we're ultimately trying to voice at like a moralistic rebirth for people, right? And like the attraction of the apocalypse story, I think, like across time, comes from this point of like after the apocalypse, there's this rebuilding, and that opportunity for rebuilding is what kind of pulls us at that fantasy, is the capacity to re-envision. And I think the tension, right, and like the image breaking down and this like consideration of time and mark making that's happening here, and this sense of like being pulled or ducked within the visual plane, I think pulls us at that possibility of like restarting.
Yeah.
Like that action does something.
That's important to note, and something I missed. It's like these signals or like ideas of apocalypse. Yeah, they're often tied in with a fresh start. Sometimes it seems so strange. But we talked about you had mentioned was it Feynman's, what was it, cataclysm sentence?
Oh, yeah.
Which you might be better at explaining that.
So Dr. Feynman, who was involved with the Manhattan Project after he retired, taught at UCLA, I believe. And there's this kind of infamous story of him in his intro to physics class, where he would start the course by asking his students to think, if the world were to end, what is the one sentence that you would give to the surviving party that comes out at the end? Which, what a hell of a way to like start a semester. But that question has come up in, you know, some like philosophical discourse, but the beloved Radio Lab podcast, if anyone listens to it, did an episode specifically on that a couple of years ago, where they asked philosophers, writers, musicians, poets, artists to give their answer. You should definitely look it up. It's really wonderful and beautiful. But we were talking about that a little bit the other day, the cataclysm sentence, because I kept misremembering the phrasing as the apocalypse question, the cataclysm sentence, the apocalypse question. So there's like grammar, the end of day, like there's a bunch of whatever. Anyway, but yeah.
But I think the reason
There's hope in it.
Yeah, I bring it up is because the question or the prompt operates under the assumption that there is something after.
There's something after, right?
So yeah, an opportunity for rebirth or you know, regeneration, which is very important to these. It's about both joy and the problems. So yeah, I mean, it's a good thing. It's important to remember those can both be true at the same time in these paintings because yeah, I sort of resist the idea that they are all doom. You know,
I don't
they
think
can't
they are.
be.
Yeah.
Because I love to paint. I love these paintings. You know, I love to use the materials to understand time, and like it's a celebration of the nature we do have and the ways that it sort of you know reappears even after its fragmentation. So yeah, it's an important.
Well, I am glad that we moved from hellscape
Yeah.
celebration.
Yes, yes.
I think that maybe is a good time, if it's okay
Yeah.
with you all,
Please.
to
Yeah.
field some questions. But I also, beyond thanking you all for being here and doing this, I also wanted to say, I know Letitia loves the limelight. Everybody put June 27th on your calendar. Our next show is going to open on June 27th. We're going to have Letitia Quisenberry, and we're going to have a special performance by Tara Jane O'Neill, who's coming in just for this. So it's going to be a very special night. I hope that you can come. So please put down Friday, June 27th in pen on the calendar, and we will. It's going to be just as gorgeous as this, and we're going to, you know, enjoy the sunset and be together again. So if you have a question, now is the time. And after, you know, we've got a few questions, then we can, you know, enjoy some cold drinks and go out and take in the fine weather. And I do have a couple of small presents for you before you go, so don't leave without them.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Questions? Queries?
I've actually been looking, it's interesting that you brought up Bosch, because I just whispered in his ear about Roydwood. It seems to me that this large painting on the right, when you talk about like the movement of the marks and so on, it does seem like you are creating a narrative of some sort, which even though there are no figures in it, it feels very populated. And I'd like you to talk a little bit, address that. And also, the other question I have is that these are all landscapes, but they're all in portrait format.
Yeah. Well, I mean, the proportions I think it kind of reminds me of the body, I guess, and it's about putting people in front of them and immersing, I guess, especially in the large scale, the large format images. So, you know, these are also if they're challenging linear time, then I also kind of want to break down pictorial space and sort of, I don't know, make a counter practice to the sort of panoramic Hudson River slow format because that's just the traditional way of making them. But I wanted it to be less about. It's about sort of collapse of space and time. So these things aren't um, spreading. They're not sprawling. They're being fragmented and made smaller, and then sort of shoved up in this sort of format, which makes it feel like there's a lot of action going. I think. I mean, I don't know if that's as as clear of an explanation, but the format is meant to sort of assist with the right, like the breakdown of pictorial space or illusions of space.
I'd like to, oh, I'm sorry.
Yeah, go ahead.
I'd like to follow up Julian's question with perhaps a comment. I feel like the portrait versus landscape makes a lot of sense because a lot of us now are viewing landscapes through our phones. With like our phones are between us. Either we're taking pictures or we're going back and viewing them later. So it's really strange. I actually feel like the portrait format is really comforting.
Interesting.
Like, you know, and maybe takes away. I know that like something that you talked about is like feeling the weight of really loaded history of landscape on your work. And I think the portrait format takes some of that away.
Yeah, that's a good observation. That's definitely something that has come up, that the proportions that reflect the proportions of our phones. Yeah, I mean, that's how we sort of are digesting visual information from the world. It seems often now, it's just like the technology we're using. So it does make sense. And if you think about those formats, they are also sort of creating alternative spaces and
Right.
temporalities. So definitely an interesting way to think about them. Thank you.
Well, if I can add another comment to the
Yeah.
comment. It's interesting too, because we often think about our phones as kind of like separating or distancing ourselves, but it does feel like when you kind of talk about like the idea of a portrait and reorienting the landscape as a portrait, then it also feels like maybe this signifying a reassociation with the earth, or the environment, and sort of a rejection of the sort of manifest destiny of that time period, and maybe like a communal suffering or something, or like a more embodied an embodiment with the landscape, maybe.
Yeah, definitely.
But it's like it's very resonant.
Thank you. Yeah, I think, yeah, there's something to it. I mean, I always use these large ones as the example, but I was like, I want this to be around my height, standing in front of them. It's like about, yeah, like reformatting, recontextualizing, and identifying with them.
So you guys are great because you turned me on to that book, Time,
Oh, yeah.
right? It's a collection of writings, so it's by Amelia Broom. And it's actually brought up by me. But what if, this is a question, so what if this isn't about the pure physics, the pure action? What if it's the human perception? So like somebody like Robert Lanza, who wrote the book Biocentrism. So then it goes back to the idea of what you do with deconstruction of a portrait, so you had to stop because it was unnerving or unnatural at some point. But then this becomes much more accessible in terms of folding and unfolding that perception. So then the orientation towards the portrait is like a mirror.
Yeah, absolutely. Those early drawings were a lot about, like you mentioned the fallibility of memory. So the flaws in perceptions of time. So this is where it started, thinking about imagining alternatives to linear time began with understanding that the perception of time is flawed, and that leaves room for maybe like imaginative visualizations. So yeah, I think the body and like the figure, it was like a site for those temporalities to sort of play out. And it's like we experience these facets of time differently than they are mapped on a line, so it's, just creating maybe a more, like a closer version of our perception, maybe.
Yeah. I mean, I also think about like the significance of specific moments and their weight on how we experience chronological time, right? Like we all have that somewhat universal experience now of like, oh my God, COVID was 5 years ago. Like, wasn't it 6 months ago? Like this sort of like collective mis-experience of time due to the significance of one moment over another, right? And so like the fallibility of time then becomes like this understanding of chronological time and its relationship to how we experience those myriad moments within it, right? Whether beautiful or tragic. Yeah, and for me, like the joy of thinking about the fallibility of memory is the opportunity to think about, you know, that which we remember as wonderful and how we can imagine it being even better or like extended or, you know, right? Like we think about like fantasy and all of these sorts of things. I think they have the opportunity to be imagined within memory in an interesting way. So the fallibility of memory then doesn't have to be about like the weakness of memory, but it becomes more about like the stretchiness of it.
Yeah.
Maybe.
Yeah.
Like the roominess.
Yeah, flaw is not a bad thing for me. When I say
Right,
it's
right.
flawed, it's not a bad thing. I think it's just that it's, yeah, I mean, it
Yeah.
just could be many things.
Right.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it.
Other questions?
All right. Well, thanks for coming.
Thank you all so much.